Hello and welcome back. You're looking at Dylan Larkin because his hat trick last night helped me advance to the finals in THHL, my main money league, and his week last week was one for the ages. 5 goals, 3 assists, 2 power play points, 16 shots in 4 games that were absolutely critical for fantasy playoffs all over the fantasy spectrum. I will always remember players who step up for me in my times of need, and Larkin, Verhaeghe, Pasternak, they all did that for me this weekend. And you'll remember from the preseason videos that I picked up Larkin right after my draft was finished. So technically, an undrafted player that I've held on to all year for elite level shot volume and production out of a player who was an afterthought in my draft, that's something to celebrate. But he is 86% owned, and if you can't pick him up off waivers, you're going to need somebody else. So as we always do on Monday, we're going to look at the guys that you can have, the top performers from last week under or around 50% ownership. 3 forwards, 2D, 1 goalie, and then at the end, we'll take a look at the top risers on both the player and goalie hubs, and I'll give you a few more tips and tricks to help you in your championship week. But let's start the video with one of Larkin's teammates who also had a crazy heater this week, and that might have helped you out if you picked him up, and that is David Perron. 52% owned, a little bit lower before this week, obviously, on an incredible week. 4 games, 4 goals, 2 assists, 3 power play points, 10 shots, and 7 hits, a little bit of everything from Perron. On the season, 50 points in 76 games is not bad, 22 power play points. He's definitely become a power play specialist in Detroit. 3 game winners on top of all of that. When you look at his hub, the power play is where you're going to get most of your value from Perron. Earlier in the year, it was Kubalik and Perron on opposite sides of the top of the circle spots, whatever you want to call it, the Ovechkin office on either side. And lately, he's been back on power play 1. And on top of that, he's playing top line with Dylan Larkin and Kubalik. So they've put those 3 together. They had an incredible week. I would imagine they stick with it. This goes back a little bit further than the last 4 games for Perron, though. 4 goals, 5 assists, 9 points in his last 8 games. So it's not just a great week. It's been happening for a little bit longer than that. If you look at the monthly breakdown, he had 11 points in 13 games in November, 10 points in 13 in December, and he was fantasy relevant at that point. Then he drops off 3 points in 13 in January, 8 points in 12 in February, coming back up a little bit. And then in March, 12 points in 15 games. So he's been trending in the right direction for 2 months now after a disappointing January, and he has returned to fantasy relevance, which is why his ownership is back to 52%. The rest of his category coverage is pretty good. 0.66, so what is that? Yeah, 2/3 of a point per game. 82nd percentile in goals, 84th percentile in shots, 2.34 shots per game. And he's been getting a couple hits here and there, 1.32 hits per game as well. He had 7 hits in 4 games this past week, so he's been a relatively physical player in an offensive role who's getting you the power play production that you need. The ice time's been really stable and consistent between mid-14s to 17-minute time on ice, depending on situations. Obviously, if they don't get power plays, he's going to play a little bit less. Noting this week, you're going to want to think about the schedule with every single player, so I'm mentioning it with every one of these guys that we're going to talk about today. Detroit has 6 games this week, 0 off-night games, and 1 back-to-back. So pretty favorable schedule. Obviously, the top 4 teams that we mentioned in yesterday's video have 7 games. A lot of those are going to be on the heavy nights, but Detroit has 6 games, which is not bad at all, and they are probably out of it, probably in that position to play spoiler down the stretch. And, motivation is going to be a critical factor in this point in your fantasy season, because sometimes, obviously, guys like Boston, teams like Boston were resting guys yesterday and throughout the weekend. Marner sat yesterday. That could affect your entire fantasy week. So you're going to want to find guys that are still going to be playing and still have something to play for. David Perron has been a veteran player, very consistent over his career, and I would consider him to be a safer option this week if you need that production. But up next is, speaking of teams that were resting players, one guy benefited from that, and that is Tyler Bertuzzi. 25% owned, dual eligible left wing, right wing, 2 goals, 1 assist, all of those points on the power play this week, 10 shots and 8 hits. So that's been his main party piece, is the fact that he is a grittier player. He does get into the battles a little bit, and he does hit a little bit. 1 hit per game average on the season, 2.2 shots per game. and the power play percentile was a lot better when he was in Detroit. But because of the fact that they were sitting guys like Bergeron, guys like Charlie McAvoy sat, they had a couple of other guys that were out. So he got a little bit more power play time this past week, and he made it count with 3 power play points. Right now, he's currently listed as line 2 with Krejci and Pastrnak. So that is a really nice line assignment if that sticks. He has 3 goals, 6 assists, 9 points in 16 games since being traded to Boston. And he's scored points in 8 out of those 16 games. So it's not been one of those situations where he's scoring a bunch of points in one game and going cold for 6 or 7. He's been scoring basically in half the games that he's played in for Boston. Now, it is worth noting this week that Boston has 5 games, 1 off-night game, and 1 back-to-back, so it may not be the most favorable schedule, and they may not be the team you want to target if they're going to continue to rest players. But what I would imagine from Boston is that they've got the rest out of the way. They're going to want to, come into the playoffs with some momentum, be playing their best hockey when the playoffs start. So I would imagine as the week progresses, they're going to ramp up their energy levels and ramp up their intensity and hopefully continue this playoff style hockey that they've pretty much been playing all season long. So this is something to be monitoring later in the week if you need it. Definitely check their schedule to see if it works with your fantasy schedule, to see if you can get him in your lineup, but dual position eligibility will help that as well. But a really good week for Tyler Bertuzzi, and again, one of the main factors here, shot volume, power play, especially if he's going to get an elevated role with guys sitting, and then assist coverage. The goals have been a little bit lower than expected, and he typically does hit a little bit more than this, so you could expect a little bit more of a bump in production in that. But nonetheless, a really good week for Tyler Bertuzzi. That brings us to our third player this week. The third forward is Bryan Rust, 50% owned, single position right winger, and it's been this is one of those players that I was high on in the preseason, and it just did not happen for him this year. He was never good enough to be fantasy relevant in a 12-team league for me. 45 points in 76 games, 19 goals, 26 assists, 200 shots is pretty good. And you'll see that here, 2.63 shots per game is his main fantasy feature, the fact that he does shoot the puck a bunch. But it has been relatively disappointing for Rust all season long until this week. 3 goals, 2 assists, 5 points, 1 power play point, 11 shots, 5 hits, 4 blocks. A little bit of everything this past week. 1.26 hits per game on the season, 0.58 blocks per game, so a little bit higher than that this past week. And then he brought the offense this week as well. Now he's currently listed line 1 with Crosby and Gensel. That's the line that helped them win the Stanley Cup back-to-back years. They've been together at various points over the last number of seasons, and they have really good chemistry together. So if that stays as the line assignment, that's really nice for Bryan Rust's ownership levels. 0.59 point per game is a little bit low, and to that point, his 5-year point per game is 0.75. Last year, he was at 0.96. His 5-year high is 1.01. So this is a really low year for him, offensively speaking. His worst month was November, 3 points in 14 games. And March, he was not very good at all. 4 points in 14 games in March. But he has 4 points in just 2 games in April. So he's very streaky, very hot and cold. It's been impossible for me to tell when he's going to go off, which is why I missed out on this production. Not that I could fit him in my lineup. I'm pretty right-wing heavy right now as it is. But you look at the shot volume, 3 shots, 4, 1, 3, getting a little bit of power play time as well. I believe he's PP2 right now. And so this is one of those players that I can't necessarily recommend you go out and pick up, especially with Pittsburgh only having 5 games this week, no off-night games, no back-to-backs. But nonetheless, he had a really good week, and if he's going to continue this, and he does have that line assignment, if you're trying to find an injury replacement for somebody, this could be a file that you go to. The ownership is pretty high considering his relatively low point per game numbers, and goal per game numbers is okay, but you would like to see his ownership a little bit lower to be able to access this file. But he's relatively complete at a 72 overall on the hits and blocks hub, so this is what you're getting out of him, a relatively complete player, really good shot volume and exposure to Crosby and Gensel at a time when they're fighting for a playoff spot. And that is one thing that is going to be a theme with a number of these players. Are they playing for anything down the stretch? And right now, Bryan Rust and the Penguins are fighting for a final wildcard spot with the Panthers. So this is definitely one of those situations where Maybe 5 games out of a player who's motivated is going to be more beneficial for your fantasy team than 6 or 7 games out of a player who's not that motivated to perform anymore. So just wanted to mention that before we move on, but an excellent week for Bryan Rust. And now let's turn to his teammate as we switch to the defenseman. A guy I picked up in a couple different leagues over the weekend, Jeff Petry, 50% owned. This is mostly a hits and blocks play, so if you don't have those categories, maybe steer clear of Jeff Petry just because the offense isn't necessarily always there, especially with Letang in the lineup taking up all the power play time. But 2 assists, a power play assist, 12 hits, 3 hits per game, and 10 blocks, 2.5 blocks per game over the past week, and that's what you're getting. 98th percentile in hits, 93rd in blocks, and you're still getting some offensive production. 80th percentile in assists, 74th percentile in power play, 72nd in shots, and half a point per game with all of that said. So he's been relatively productive, especially when he gets an elevated role in the lineup. Right now he's second pair and PP2, so he's not necessarily getting those top pair minutes that he was getting with Letang out. But who knows with Letang? He could go down next game and then Petry comes up and becomes the power play 1 quarterback. So it's a nice little insurance policy to have if you have Letang to double up with Petry. The only problem with that is, again, Pittsburgh plays 5 games, no off nights this week. So you're not necessarily going to get the volume out of him. But again, Pittsburgh is fighting for a playoff spot. They need everybody in the lineup contributing. They need to chip away at the standings and try to make a playoff push. So they're going to be playing their best hockey down the stretch. So if you want one of those Penguins, this is a guy you can get for hits and blocks coverage mainly, but he does give you a little bit of an offensive bump as well. And he's a 75 on the player hub because of the fact that he's relatively complete. The only thing low is his goal per game percentile, which is weird because he did score a bunch of goals when he was with Montreal a couple years ago. So if he can find that form and start to put some goals in the back of the net, then he becomes a lot more valuable. And you look at his time on ice, 24 minutes, 25 minutes, 23 minutes. Ice time was a little bit further down, trying to rest him in the second night of a back-to-back. But he does play a ton. So you're getting a lot of ice time to rack up those hits and blocks. So that is beneficial as well. So a nice week from Jeff Petry. And another teammate of his, Brian Dumoulin, similar situation, mainly a hits and blocks play. 10 blocks in 4 games, 5 hits in that span as well, but 4 assists. So a little bit more offense out of Dumoulin, and this is more of a deeper league play at 2% owned. He's a lot less complete on the hub. He's a 44, so no power play time for Dumoulin. Hardly any goals, maybe 1 or 2 goals on the season. In fact, just 1 goal on the season. 1 goal, 22 assists, 23 points in 77 games. The hits and blocks are what you're going to own him for. 94th percentile in blocks, 71st in hits, 1.5 hits per game. And then again, 2 assist game against Philly, 1 assist against Boston, 1 against Nashville. So he's been relatively productive offensively lately, which is a good sign for Pittsburgh as they, again, need him to produce, need everybody to produce to get into the playoffs. But 3 Penguins players are on here, and they're fighting for the playoffs. This is how we can find some fantasy value. Who still has something to play for? Pittsburgh has something to play for. Florida has something to play for. Seattle, Winnipeg, all these teams that are on the bubble, trying to make a playoff push. Nashville's even right there. Nashville with a 7-game schedule, and they're trying to make a playoff push. That could be one of the places that you can find some fantasy value, and we'll take a look at that when we look at the player hubs in just a minute. But nonetheless, this is the theme that's going on with a lot of these players in today's video. They are playing for something, and that has boosted their performance, which is something that we need to take a note of as fantasy managers. Along that same line of thought, let's turn to the goaltender of the week, and there is no debate. It is Alex Lyon, 7% owned, and he basically saved the Florida Panthers' entire season. They were forced to start him against Toronto. He comes and puts in a really good effort. They get the come-from-behind victory in overtime to save their season. He gets the start the following night because Bobrovsky couldn't go, and then he gets the start on Saturday, puts up a shutout, 3-0 shutout against Montreal. A 7-0 shutout against Columbus, the 5-2 win against Montreal. So an excellent week for Alex Lyon. 3 wins, 133 goals against, 951 save percentage with that shutout included. On the season, 6-3-1 is a really good record. The 324 goals against is not great, and the 896 save percentage is not great either. But a lot of that came before the All-Star break. Since the All-Star break, 4 games, 3-1 record, 2.28 goals against, and a .913 save percentage. So a lot better since then, and that's basically around the time when they lost Spencer Knight to the player assistance program. So he's been the backup at that point, and he's been playing a lot better in the playoff stretch run down into this part of the season where he's now been relied upon to help get them into the playoffs. If you look at his hub, he's not that impressive, a 28, because he doesn't start at all. Doesn't get a lot of wins because of the fact that he doesn't start. His team isn't necessarily great defensively, 27th percentile in team expected goals against per game. The goals saved above expected is not horrible. Negative 1.45 is about mid-pack in the 40s or 50s, depending on how many goalies you're going to count. And then the save percentage is obviously a little bit lower than what you would want. League average right around 905, somewhere in that vicinity. So he's below that. But lately, he's been a 913 in his last 4 games. So he's been trending in the right direction. Now, it is worth noting that the Florida Panthers only have 5 games this week. And if Bobrovsky's healthy, I would imagine they give him at least 4 of those games, if not all 5. So this might not be the best pickup. But if you're in a situation where you need a spot start, and you see Lyon playing in any of these games where it's a seemingly favorable matchup or a must-win game, just know that he can do it. He can provide value for your fantasy team, and he can help the Florida Panthers try to make a playoff push when push comes to shove. He's been very good in these big games that he's had to perform in. So an excellent week for Alex Lyon. And on that note, let's take a look at the goaltending hubs to try to find some other goaltending trends heading into the week. So you can see down here, Alex Lyon, massive change interval because he doesn't start a lot, and he had an incredible week. So he's been the most improved goaltender of the week by a large margin. He's been incredible this past week, but a number of other guys are performing well, and some other guys are starting to drop off. Phoenix Copley has sort of lost the net a little bit in LA. He did get a couple of starts, but it seems like they're going to try to ride Korpisalo as we head towards the playoffs. That could be interesting if you own Copley. I believe they only have 5 games this week, so that could be something that you might have to drop him if he's only going to get 1 or 2 starts this week and you need some volume. But that is worth noting because if you have Korpisalo like I do, he's been playing incredibly well. I just have to pull up his numbers real quick. So for Korpisalo, he's a 74 on the hub. The team exposure is 88th percentile, which is really good, but he's also a really skilled goalie, 88th percentile in goals saved above expected, 916 save percentage on the season. But before the trade in January, he had an 898 save percentage. In February, 933 save percentage, a 3-2 record. In March, 7 games played, 4-2-1 record, 933 save percentage, and in April, 1 game, 960 save percentage. So he's been incredible since the trade, and that has been one sort of nice feature to the trade deadline. The fact that when I did the analysis, it seemed like all of the offensive players had around a .22 point per game bump after being traded, but I didn't look at goaltending, and this is one of those goaltenders that did get a massive bump in terms of his fantasy relevance and his fantasy value. I picked him up in 2 of my leagues, and he's been incredibly huge for me, helping me get to the championship in those leagues as well. So he's been a really nice file. So you might have to think about this Copley-Korpisalo split, as the LA Kings are one of the best teams in the West, and they're continuing to push for home ice in the playoffs. A couple of other trends that we should talk about. If Kochetkov, for whatever reason, if Carolina has any goaltending injuries, you're going to want to stay with your eyes glued to the waiver wire and try to pick up Kochetkov as soon as that happens, because anybody who's in net for Carolina is going to have really good numbers, because Carolina is one of the best, actually the second best defensive team in the league behind Boston. So they're quite a ways behind Boston because nobody can kind of compete with Boston defensively or offensively this season. But Anderson trending in the right direction. Ranta had a really good week as well. He put a shutout up. He's been trending in the right direction as well. So if one of those guys goes down, keep your eyes on Kochetkov. That's been a really nice play throughout the season. He's only had really like 2 bad games in the past number of months that he's played because he's been up and down. But really good fantasy file if you can get access to it. Ranta is around 43% owned. If you can get him, that would be beneficial as well. A couple of other guys, UC Saros, I'm guessing you don't have the ability to pick him up, but they have 7 games this week. Nashville's still in a playoff hunt. He'll probably get at least 5. They do have 2 back-to-backs. So who's the backup? Kevin Lankinen might get in those 2 back-to-back games. But other than that, Saros 5 starts this week could be really useful. And if you can't get him, Lankinen would be a nice backup option. The only problem is Nashville doesn't have a lot of offensive power, so you're not necessarily guaranteed a win. I was absolutely shocked when they beat Boston last week, so I had Saros on the bench for that. I was sweating that out until last night, basically, trying to catch up on wins because I put one of those on the bench. A couple of other guys that we should probably talk about. Carter Hart, he had a really great week 2 weeks ago. Last week, in and out of the lineup, was out over the weekend, and his production dropped a little bit, down 2.5 on the hub last week. So not necessarily trending in the right direction, but Philly should be one of those teams staying competitive till the end, and that is worth noting. Tristan Jarry came back last week, and he played really well in one of those games. I believe he got a shutout, so that bumped him up a little bit. If he's healthy and if he's there for you on your wire, that would be a very difficult play for me to make because he's very inconsistent this year, but they do need wins. They have to ride Jarry if he's healthy, so that could be a really nice pickup. Martin Jones, we talked about him in yesterday's video. He had a really nice start in this past week, so he's been bumped up 3.1 on the hub, but again, that 886 save percentage is not great, and we talked about that yesterday. Only 1 win in his last 5 starts, so not the best track record, but again, 7 games for Seattle. They're going to have to play Grubauer and Jones, and you might have to go one of those guys this week if you need some volume. Matt Murray's out, so that could potentially add some value for Joseph Woll. If he gets in, they do have to do some cap gymnastics to get him in, but he's relatively low owned, so if you have to get a goaltender, Joseph Woll could be one of those options, as Samsonov is probably going to start most of the games, but they're probably going to want to rest him for the playoffs as well, so that could be a nice little play. Stalock has been hot throughout the month of March, but he's tailed off a little bit over the past couple of games as Chicago tanks for Bedard. Blackwood going the wrong way, and I mentioned him yesterday as one of the goalies to pick up because of the fact that he's got the Devils team exposure, but the Devils absolutely spanked last night against Winnipeg, and they've been relatively leaky over the past month or two, so this is something to keep an eye on. They're not as good defensively as they were earlier in the season, so maybe if you have Vanacek or Blackwood, start thinking about other options that you might want to add to that to get you some quality starts as you try to make up the volume with Vanacek playing a bunch of times. Maybe Blackwood gets in a couple games this week. Reimer going the opposite way, going in the right direction, but obviously I don't really want exposure to San Jose at this point, especially for goaltending purposes. Samuel Ersson, this is another one of those things with Hart out. Ersson's been really good all year long. At various points throughout the season, he's stepped in and done really well. This could be something to keep an eye on if you need a spot start here or there. Again, Philly should be competitive down the stretch. Then the couple other guys here. Nedeljkovic, I never thought I'd see him play well, but he got a nice start last night against Toronto in Toronto, and a huge game from Larkin helped him pick up the victory there. So this is the rest of the change intervals from last week with the goaltending, but let's take a step now to the players and defensemen that you could potentially add this week to help you win your fantasy championship. So here we're just going to look at a couple of the highest changed players over the past week. This is filtered by a little bit over half a point per game just to keep some of the lower players out of it. These are the guys that you're going to want to own. Some of these are really interesting files because Tyler Johnson's a good player on a bad team. Evangelista, a young player on that Nashville team, playing 7 times this week. Same with Novak, playing 7 times this week. Frost, a young player on a team that's out of playoff contention. So a lot of these are the same type of thing. Good players on bad teams that are still playing spoiler and still producing. You have Bowen Byram. He had a really good week. If he's available, I believe he's 60% owned. He's obviously an add this week with Colorado with 7 games, 2 off-night games, a back-to-back or 2 in there. But Byram has been really productive, a 75 on the hub, and he changed 2.16 over the past week. We talked about Perron today. Sam Reinhart hit the waiver wire in my league, and he's been cranking it up as they try to make that playoff push. Bryan Rust we talked about today. Quinn Hughes, he's still doing what Quinn Hughes has done for most of the year, very assist-heavy, but nonetheless bringing the point production. Michelli, another player Really good situation, bad team, trying to play spoiler down the stretch. Usually an assist, power play heavy guy, but he's been really productive lately. In the last 2 weeks, he's got 3 goals, 2 assists, 2 power play points, and 13 shots. So getting some goal production going finally after a very assist and power play heavy first half of the season. Then you have a couple of other guys. Obviously, you're not going to get Kane. Justin Falk may or may not be there for you on your wire. He's getting some power play time in St. Louis, and they're still an offensively relevant team despite the fact that they're not getting goaltending, and they're likely going to be eliminated from the playoffs any day now. Roslovic, another one of those players on a bad team, getting an elevated role. Chandler Stevenson, 3-position eligible, which could come in handy this week because this is one of those weeks where you're going to need to add some players that have positional flexibility to help you get into the lineup. If you are trying to, add somebody and they're playing mostly those heavy nights, then you're going to need that positional flexibility, and he has that, and he's been playing a lot better recently, getting a different role in the offense for Vegas. They've been shuffling their lines a little bit. Also worth noting that Vegas has 6 games this week, 1 off-night game and 1 back-to-back. So he's going to get you a little bit of volume, and the fact that he's 3-position eligible helps him get into your lineup a little bit more. On top of that, McAvoy, he did sit out over the weekend, but he had a pretty good week otherwise with a lot of hits and blocks coverage. Braden Shen, top 6 in St. Louis. This is another one of those good players on a bad team. Jared McCann could be a huge pickup this week. A proven goal scorer, one of the best goal scorers in the league, probably going to hit 40 goals if he hasn't already. I haven't checked recently because he's not on my wire, but in a 7-game week, a guy who's center left wing eligible, he's been trending in the right direction. He's almost a 70 on the player hub, so this is an excellent time to pick up Jared McCann if you have the ability to do that. He is 60% owned, so that may not be an option for everybody, but if he's there, definitely the right week to go and pick him up. Down here, you have Tomasino, another one of those Nashville players who's trending in the right direction. Nick Ehlers picking it up. A lot of the offensive firepower in Winnipeg starting to pick it up, especially last night against the Devils. So these are some of the trends that we can find from last week. But there's a couple of teams that you want to focus on for this upcoming week because they have really good schedules. And we'll just look at each of those teams really quickly as we filter from top to bottom. Let's start with one of the teams that has 7 games this week, and that is Colorado. We're going to take out this filter for points per game. Some of these guys, Sam Girard is still fantasy relevant. Obviously not getting as much power play time lately, but all that takes is for Makar to go down or get rested for a little bit, and that bumps his value up a little bit. So if you think that Makar might get rested, Bowen Byram becomes valuable. So does Sam Girard as well. Dennis Mulligan, he's not getting the same line assignment that he was earlier, so I don't know if this is as good of a pickup for you. Obviously, the guys that you could pick up as well are the usual suspects. Your guys like JT Compher, who's a 68 on the hub. You have Evan Rodriguez, who's more of a shot volume play at a 60 overall on the hub. Josh Manson, if he's healthy, he's been a really productive hits and blocks defenseman. And I had him for a little bit, but he got... Manson. He got banged up when I owned him, so he went on IR, but 90th percentile in hits, 87th in blocks, gets a couple of assists as well. A little bit more offensive potential playing for Colorado, and it's a 7-game week. So if he's there, if he gets back healthy, then that would be a nice play on the back end. If you need hits and blocks specifically, trying to pull up what his status is. He's still out, lower body injury, and isn't expected to play Wednesday. That was, I believe, last Wednesday. So he's still day-to-day, still out at least. So that may not be an option at the beginning of the week, but maybe later in the week, you could potentially pick him up. Now let's turn to some of the other teams that play a number of times. We have Nashville. They have a 7-game week as well. Yossi still out. That's been very frustrating if you own him. Forsberg, who's been out for a while, I believe he started skating lightly, if I'm not mistaken. And this is one of those situations where if you have been stashing him on IR for this entire time, you don't have to waste an ad to get him in your lineup. So that could be really clutch when you only have 4 ads in a 12-day week. He's still currently out with an upper body injury. No news recently, but if there's any chance that he comes back and plays and you've been stashing him, that's an interesting ad that you can add to your lineup. Obviously, he's very productive. I'll just pull him up here. Very good goal scorer, obviously. 93rd percentile in goals, 95th in shot volume, 89th in power play, still hitting 1.72 hits per game. Maybe that comes down if he comes back because of that injury, but nonetheless, if you can add him via IR at this point in your season, that would be massive. Tyson Barrie, still productive. He's getting some power play time, especially with Josi out. That could be a nice little play if you're looking for power play points specifically. Josi, I don't know what the timetable is on him because it's been kind of touch and go. He's been day-to-day for about 2 weeks now. I had to drop him a while ago. Tyson Barrie, 72% owned, so he may or may not be there for you in most leagues. He's probably not there. But a bunch of these other guys are there. Tomasino is probably there for you. Novak might be there. Parsonen's out. Evangelista might be there for you. And these are a bunch of guys that are all trending in the right direction. Cody Glass could be an interesting play in a 7-game week. And again, I believe they have 7 games and 2 off nights, if I'm not mistaken. So that could be a really interesting play for volume specifically. Then you have Buffalo. They have a 7-game week as well, but they've been having a hard time getting Tage Thompson back. He was practicing today on line 1, so that will be an interesting development. But if you own him, I'm sure you're hoping to get him back, and that's another one of those things that you can add a player without using an ad. That would be massive for you in your week if you've made it this far, but you probably didn't because he's hurt you not being in the lineup as one of your top players last week and in the previous week as well. A couple of other guys here. JJ Peterka trending in the right direction, not the most complete player, but that line of Cousins, Peterka, and Quinn back together, they're still playing really well. It's just a young line, so they're very inconsistent. You can't necessarily count on them all the time, but they've been really good in small sample sizes in different segments throughout the season. Owen Power's been getting an elevated role. I believe Dahlin has tailed off a bit over the past 3 weeks or so in terms of his offensive production. He's been a couple of assists, 4 assists in his last 6 games, so nothing crazy there. Owen Power's been getting an elevated role. They want to see what they have in Buffalo at some point. Obviously, Devin Levi making his start, so they're starting to get a sense of what they can potentially get for next year. But this is another one of those plays that you could potentially add in a 7-game week to help you with some volume. But that's pretty much all you'd want to own for Buffalo. A lot of these guys, Skinner's owned up for most people. Tuck is still productive, but probably owned up. And a lot of these guys are maybe not available. So you're looking at the second line and Owen Power as your top ads from the Sabres. For Seattle, some of these guys have been very productive. Vince Dunn has been incredible for me since I picked him up around January or February. But so too has Adam Larson. He's been really hot over the past month. He's actually been outperforming Vince Dunn in leagues with hits and blocks just because of his hits and blocks coverage. Really prolific there. In fact, let's pull it up just because you can see the fact that he's a hits and blocks defenseman who does get a little bit more offense. 71st percentile in assists and 68th percentile in shots, 98th in blocks, 93rd in hits. So if he's available for you, he's definitely a nice add. Eli Tolvanen, he's got 5 goals in his past, I can't remember how many games, 6 or 7 games. Very goal heavy, no assists in that span, but he's still doing it, still productive. Tolvanen, obviously coming over from Nashville, he's been having a massive impact, 87th percentile in goal per game, and relatively complete across everything. A hit and a half per game is really good as well if you're in a bangers league, and almost 2 shots per game. I'd like to see that a little bit higher for a natural goal scorer like him. But nonetheless, he's been really productive especially for a guy who's not necessarily been given a top 6 role at all times for Seattle. But a guy who has been getting that top 6 role is McCann. I mentioned him a little bit earlier. He's one of those guys that you have to target. 96th percentile in goal production, almost half a goal per game, right around there. If he gets one or two more goals, he will be at that point, and he's 5 away from 40 goals on the season, which is incredible because a lot of these guys, this entire team has been scoring by committee. On any given night, Eberle could pop off, Schwartz could pop off, Daniel Sprong has been one of the best per 60-minute goal scorers in the league, so he's been incredibly productive. The goals per 60 race is incredible right now when you consider David Pastrnak number 1, McDavid 2, Thompson 3, Braden Point 4. Remember, Braden Point, a 9th round draft pick on average. Cole Caulfield still really productive despite the fact that he hasn't played in several months. Leon Draisaitl right behind him, and Daniel Sprong at 7th, with Jared McCann at 9th. So that's where you can find some value there. As I bring the hub back, you can see a couple of these other guys. Brandon Tanev, a hits guy who's been getting a little bit of offense here and there, but in a 7-game week, Tanev could potentially come in handy for hits coverage and a little bit of offense. 71st percentile in goals, 89th in hits, getting a couple of blocks as well. Just no power play time for Tanev. Justin Schultz at various points has been fantasy relevant. It's just a matter of, is he getting power play time? Because right now Vince Dunn has been getting a lot of it. But these are a number of guys. If Burakovsky, if there's any inkling that he might come back, that's a sneaky ad that nobody's thinking about. And he's been relatively productive when he's been in the lineup. So I don't know what the status is for Burakovsky, or if he's going to be back before playoffs or even during playoffs. But if there's any inclination that he might come back for playoffs, they're going to want to get him in a couple of games before that, maybe target him off the IR. That could be interesting. So this is the teams with 7 games this week. There's 2 teams with 6 games and 5 games, but they have 2 off-night games. First, actually, there's another team. This is Anaheim has 5 games, but 2 off-night games on this Wednesday and Sunday. Frank Vetrano would be the number 1 ad, mainly because of his shot volume. And I spelled his name wrong, but he's averaging around 3 shots per game, 2.83 shots per game, 91st percentile, 82nd percentile in goals. Still getting, for whatever reason, getting a bunch of blocks, almost a block per game, about a hit per game on top of that. Half a point per game is not great, but the 70 rating means he's very complete across all categories, and you're mainly owning him for his shot volume, which I believe over the past month has exceeded this 2.83 average. So he'd be one of the top ads there. Other than that, it's pretty barren. Cam Fowler could be a play for you on the back end. Mason McTavish could be a play for you. I'm not sure how productive he's been over the last little while. Anaheim has, I believe the stat was, they've been outscored 30-9 in their last 7 games before the weekend. So not necessarily the best place to mine fantasy value, especially in terms of goaltending. But some of these guys have been relatively productive for what they do in terms of Vetrano being still relevant for shot volume. McTavish is dual position eligible. There's just not a lot of production there lately. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend picking him up because he's not necessarily hot right now. But some of these guys may be available, whereas other teams' players might not be available. So you might have to find somebody here. I actually picked up Derek Grant yesterday in my face-off league. He picked up, I think, 13 face-off wins and helped me get into the finals. So I'm very thankful for Derek Grant. But now let's turn to Dallas. Dallas has 6 games and 2 off-night games. The first Monday, which is tonight, and then they play next Wednesday, which is an off-night game. A lot of these guys are going to be owned up. Rope Hintz hit the wire in my league for a brief period of time. He's been scooped up. Max Domi is probably available for you, and he's 3-position eligible. That could be where the only place that you can mine some value. Maybe Dadonov becomes an ad just because of the fact that he's probably going to get top 6 exposure. I'm trying to bring up their line assignment right now. Yeah, so that second line is Wyatt Johnston, Jamie Benn, and Evgeny Dadonov. Max Domi on the third line with Faxa and Sagan, which is pretty decent for a third line assignment for Max Domi, and he's 3-position eligible. Dadonov, 2-position left wing, right wing eligible. Johnston is a single position center, so he's a little bit less valuable. Colin Miller, drastically improving over the past week. I wouldn't necessarily expect that to continue. He's not known for his production offensively, but he apparently did have a really good week last week. I'm pulling up his file right now as we speak. A goal, a bunch of hits and blocks. That's mainly where that production is coming from, not necessarily offensively, but a couple of shots, hits, and blocks over the past number of days. Some of these guys are, Niels Lundqvist, power play 2 specialist. Maybe you go there in a deep league, but a lot of these guys are not necessarily fantasy relevant. Mason Marchment, usually I would think of him as a hitter, but he hasn't been doing that a lot this year, I should say. Did a lot more of that last year with Florida, and he did a lot more goal scoring last year as well. 1.31 hits per game is not necessarily elite level, but he's relatively complete across everything. Just a reminder, again, Dallas 6 games this week, 2 off nights. There is one other team that plays on 2 off nights, and that is Calgary, but they only have 5 games. They are in a playoff push, though, so they might have more of an incentive to perform for your fantasy team. Rasmus Andersson been playing pretty decent lately. Toffoli's the number 1 ad, or own, I should say, in Calgary. You're probably not adding him. The number 1 ad is probably Backlund, and I've been saying this for a long time on the channel. Backlund is a shot volume monster. 3.19 shots per game, 95th percentile, 0.68 points per game, so still relatively productive offensively, and I'm trying to pull up his percentage right now. He is 49% owned, so he might be there for you in a 12-team league, probably there for you in a 10-team league. 17 goals, 35 assists, 12 power play points, 246 shots on the year for Backlund. Some of these other guys are maybe ownable. Dubé, I'm not sure. He was red hot for that stretch. I think it was like maybe a month and a half ago. He was absolutely on fire. He has not been that hot since. Only 2 assists in his last 8 or 9 games. Not a lot of shot volume in the last 3, and not a lot of anything else to speak of in terms of Dubé. And I think that was line assignment dependent. Mangiapane could be an interesting play just because he has the pedigree. He's been a goal scorer in various capacities. Obviously, last year he had 35 goals. So he was one of those guys that was probably highly thought of coming into the season. It just hasn't worked for him, same as hasn't worked for Huberdeau and a number of other offensive players in Calgary. I would imagine that they're going to fire Sutter at some point, especially if they miss the playoffs. He will more than likely be gone, in my opinion. But over the last 3 games, 2 goals, 1 assist for Mangiapane, a number of shots. He's got 8 shots in those 3 games as well, and 2 power play points. So he's been getting a little bit more production lately. Mangiapane could be a nice play from Calgary. They have, again, 5 games this week, 2 off-night games, and he's 32% owned. So that could be your best option off the waiver wire as he's been improving lately. Michael Stone. This was a conversation I had with Fantasy Puck earlier in the season, and I mentioned him in some of the preseason videos in terms of his goal production being ridiculous. It hasn't been that way this year because he hasn't played a ton of games, but for whatever reason, he does score on a high percentage of his shots. Not sure what it is. He obviously has a bomb, but it's also very accurate. So you're going to mainly own him for, 1.1 hits and blocks per game. But if you can add that plus the shot volume and some goal production in a really, really deep league, this could be a nice little play, especially on those off nights where you're going to get 2 off-night games out of him. I believe that's going to do it. There is, I think, one other team that has a couple of off-night games. Nope, that's all of them. That's all the teams with 2 off-night games. There's a bunch of teams with 1 off-night game. We're not going to go through all of those, but just wanted to give you guys a little bit more detail to try to help you win your fantasy week this week. If you're in your championship, I'm assuming you're trying to find any value that you can, and this is a way that you can do it. One last thing I wanted to mention here. I wanted to give a shout out. This is a schedule I found from TJstats on Twitter. He does a really good job with his data analysis, and this is his schedule. And I want to give him a lot of credit. This is way better than the schedule that I created at the beginning of the season. He's got a score over here, the total games played, the off nights, the back-to-backs, and he's got these little emojis here for a tired opponent, which factors into the score. And this has been a resource that I've been using lately to try to help me with my own ads. And because I've been using it, I kind of wanted to give him a shout out. He was pretty helpful trying to help me with a Python project earlier a couple weeks ago. So definitely want to shout him out. If you need a scheduled tool for this week, because it's a very crazy week spanning 12 days from the 3rd to the 14th, this will definitely help you navigate those waiver ads. But that's going to do it for this video. If you watched all the way through, congratulations. You're incredible. I didn't expect anybody to follow this for 45 minutes, but thank you for doing that. And I hope you have the best of luck in your championship week. And I will see you later in the week for a midweek update.